It's been a while since I had to come to the defense of my man Vlad Dracula, the absolute Chad of Wallachia. Yes, folks, as you probably guessed, I'm a bit of a fan of Dracula, both the fictional vampire by Bram Stoker and the real historical Prince of Wallachia. I've done 3 response videos defending the vampire Dracula, and I'm writing a book called The Revenant King, which features a modern-day Dracula. As for the real Vlad Dracula, I've created a full video essay on the man's history, which I hope y'all will take some time to watch. Today, though, we'll be taking a look at this video by Nutty History, who wants to tell us why Vlad the Impaler was the true face of evil! Yeah, needless to say, Vlad was not evil, and I will be more than happy to defend my boy Vlad once again. So let's start by, of course, since this is a thematic thing, changing my avatar. Let's see. There we go. Gonna go with the vampire Claire on this one. Yes, I know Vlad Dracula wasn't a vampire himself, but hey, come on, it's spooky month. I gotta, let's just go with it. Alright, let's rock and roll. Let's see what they have to say about my boy, Vlad Dracula.
Vlad III, the Prince of Wallachia, is among a very rare club of people in human history who have transcended beyond real history and established themselves as a larger-than-life personality. But what did the son of dragon really do to earn the notoriety and infamy that has only grown with time and turned a mere man into a monster? Welcome to Nutty History. Today, let's find out if Vlad Dracula, the Prince of Wallachia, was truly the face of pure evil.
Will you please stop saying that?
Well, spoiler alert, he was not. There's no question that Vlad did some pretty harsh things to his enemies, but it wasn't anything not done by his neighbors or enemies themselves. And in fact, many of the tactics Vlad used that we consider so barbaric were first taught to him by the Ottoman Empire, which held him captive for most of his childhood. So if we're to call Vlad's actions evil and barbaric, we must include the ones who taught him how to be.
The Bloody Lunch at Brushev. In the second half of the 1450s, Vlad was at war with other cities of Transylvania, Brushev, and Sibiu. Sibiu was ruled by Vlad's own half-brother, and the other was ruled by Dan III, who was dreaming of snatching Wallachia from Vlad.
Okay, keep that name in mind. Dan III, keep it in mind. He's important later.
These cities were heavily populated by the Saxons, and not the native Romanian population. Not to be confused with Anglo-Saxons of the British Isles, the Transylvanian Saxons were German migrants who settled in the regions conquered by the Habsburg King of Hungary in the mid-12th century. They were prosperous merchants who boosted the economy of Transylvania and fortified several cities. Now, while native Romanians were mostly peasants who became inferior people in their own country after the Saxons gathered the wealth and favors of rulers, not to mention Saxons were Catholics and Romanians were Romanian Orthodox, another wedge that separated the two. When Vlad declared war on the Saxons, he dealt rather quickly with his half-brother, and then laid siege at Brushev.
Yes, this is true. Now, would you please explain why Vlad declared war on the Saxons? Because context is important here, so I hope you'll explain the reason for his actions. Are you going to tell us why he was at war with the Saxons? Or are you going to leave that open and not mention why? Let's find out.
Back then, Brushev was the heart of Transylvania with the richest coffers, the strongest army to defend a city, and a 14-foot thick wall supplemented with bastions spaced out strategically. The Saxon king of Brushev was sure that his city was safe. That indeed would have been the case if it weren't against Vlad. Vlad grew up in cities like this, and he knew them inside out.
This isn't quite true. Vlad was 12 years old and he was given over to the Ottoman Sultan as a hostage and captive, and he wouldn't be released for 6 years until he was about 18 years old.
Vlad chose to attack at night and neutralize the city guard as he ransacked the surrounding suburbs. He wiped out the entire village of Bod and took several prisoners at Targoviste. The observer said that the people of Toms were shredded like cabbage and the village was set on fire. When the army moved out to douse the fire of burning places of worship, silos, and storage houses, Vlad was waiting for them. You can see where the myth of Dracula being the most powerful at night came from, can you not?
Alright, this is true for the most part, but as I expected, you deliberately left out the context for the war with Brasov. Allow me to fill in the blanks you left out, because context matters. When Dracula took power in Wallachia, the Saxons were secretly plotting to put Dan III, that guy you casually mentioned earlier, the one I told you to remember, they planned to put him in power instead. And they were also monopolizing and violating the trade agreements that Dracula was trying to enforce. As Raymond Ibrahim writes in his book, Defenders of the West, quote, The Hungarian governor sent a letter to these same nobles of Brasov asking them to help oust Dracula and install another pretender, Dan. The Saxons were only too happy to comply. They were already monopolizing and therefore violating the free trade agreement they had recently ratified with Vlad and abusing their privilege in Wallachia. Meanwhile, the Saxons of Sibiu were supporting yet another claimant to the Wallachian throne. Yes, suddenly casts a whole new light on the conflict now, doesn't it? It's the difference between saying a bear viciously mauled 3 children and 3 children threw rocks at a sleeping bear until it woke up and mauled them. See, both ends result in tragedy, but the second one gives context that helps us understand why that happened. But I know where they're going with the story, so let's get it over with. Go ahead, finish up.
The next day, Saxons were forced to send a diplomat to negotiate with Vlad, and when the diplomat arrived at Tom's, he must have imagined he stumbled into hell. Vlad was sitting among the 20,000 prisoners of war. These prisoners were suspended on stakes. A few of them were still alive, and the entire ground was crimson with the smell of iron in the air. The diplomat noticed that the stench of death was bothering Vlad's army as well, while the tyrant was calmly eating his food among the grove of corpses that he had created. One knight made the mistake of covering his nose, and that offended Vlad. He asked his soldiers to put the knight on one of the stakes immediately along with the prisoners, and they obliged.
Okay, so let's go ahead and make this clear. While it is reported that Vlad did indeed impale many Saxons afterwards, the reports of him dining among the corpses is not quite as certain. Back when the Hungarian government was trying to demonize Vlad Dracula, the king, Matthias Corvinus, sold a great deal of false and slanderous propaganda pieces around Romania of Vlad performing vicious and demonic acts just like this. And the dining on the blood of his victims or feasting on the corpses is just one of the many propaganda pieces. Now, with that said, it is also not entirely impossible that he did this. After all, impalement was not a new form of execution, nor was Vlad the only one who practiced it. It was practiced by the Turks and other countries besides this one. In fact, dining on the corpses of victims was also attributed to Turkish history well before Vlad. In fact, according to Dracula historian Kurt Triptow in his book Dracula Essays on the Life and Times of Vlad the Impaler, he writes, quote, Murad II held a feast among the corpses of vanquished Christians. Since Dracula spent 6 years of his childhood among the Turks, he likely learned how to adopt their tactics for himself. But, look, I know what you're all probably thinking. Well, even if he wasn't the one to do it, it's still unjustifiable, Raven. Well, maybe to our modern sensibilities, yes. But for the time period? No. In fact, according to historian Anton Balota, quote, Dracula's invasions of the Transylvanian lands of the Saxons was not the product of an evil policy of a voivode bent on massacre, but the result of a deliberate and conscious policy applied with a cruelty which was characteristic of the time. And even the king of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus, the liege lord of the Saxons and the one who would later go on to slander Dracula, in a letter to Sibiu wrote, You yourselves, through your own greed, gave him, Vlad, reason to come against you, causing great damage. For this you must bear some of the guilt. For the time period, what Vlad did was harsh, but accepted for the time period. It seems barbaric and cruel today, but at the time period, it was just standard policy. One created and cultivated by a people constantly at war and used to betrayal and backstabbing. Vlad was actually appreciated by his own people for it, as it solidified his reputation for not putting up with those who would attempt to undermine his rule and Wallachia's interest. So, first point debunked. Next.
Vlad's enemies dug their own grave. Vlad sat there calmly, waiting for the diplomat as he ate his lunch al fresco style, dipping his bread in the cranberry juice he had mustered from the victims the night before. There was no negotiation, citing that before Vlad waged war, he had offered diplomatic reasoning to these cities, but they ignored him. So he wanted to make sure this time he wouldn't be ignored or taken less seriously. The man had learned cruelty from the best, but he took it to a whole nother level.
Citation, please. As I proved earlier, nothing he did was at another level. He was just very good at it. The actions he took were not any more or less barbaric than those enacted by the Turks or his own neighbors. The difference was that the Turks were not used to these actions being used against them, and Vlad's neighbors were not used to Wallachia having a voivode who would fight back. Don't try to muddy the waters here by saying, oh, he learned cruelty from others, but he was way worse about it. I'm waiting on you to mention the Turks and what they taught him. Get to it. Come on. Tell me about what the Turks taught this guy. Because yes, if you want to call Vlad cruel, absolutely, but where did he learn that? Please get to that.
When Vlad's father died in 1447, Sultan Murad himself delivered the news to the bitter young man, and surprisingly released him on the condition that he joined the Ottoman army.
This is half true. The truth is that Vlad's father had to hand over Vlad and his brother Vadu to the Ottoman Sultan as hostages so that their daddy wouldn't ever stand up to the Turks again. When Vlad's father died, and he was betrayed and killed by the way, the Sultan needed someone on the Third of Alakia who he thought would be loyal. He thought Vlad would fit the bill, and he was terribly wrong. This was not an act of kindness or generosity from Murad. This was an act of pragmatism and opportunity that the Sultan greatly miscalculated. You're trying to avoid mentioning the actions and behaviors of the Turks at the time and making Murad sound like he was being compassionate. He was not. Please, be honest about the situation.
He was asked to take Wallachia from John Hunyadi's puppet, Vladislav II, who were the Hungarians who had replaced Vlad's father as the ruler of Wallachia. Vlad wanted to rule Wallachia too as his birthright, but not under the thumb of the Sultan of the Ottomans. After defeating Vladislav once, Vlad defected to join Hunyadi's army. Surprisingly, Vladislav also switched sides to seek support from the Ottomans. What a switcheroo! After Hunyadi died in 1456, Vlad reached out to Hungarians and regained Wallachia with their support. Vlad caught up with Dan III, who was Vladislav II's brother, a year later after the siege of Bruzov. He made the deposed king dig his own grave while a priest read the burial mass for Dan, and then Vlad put Dan in the grave and had his head lopped off. That just ain't right. That ain't right at all. On any level. That's just wrong.
That seems, pretty tame, honestly. I mean, he could have impaled him, or drawn and quartered him, or tortured him to death, or even buried him alive in his own grave, but no, Vlad had him dig his grave, and still gave him a Christian funeral rite before cutting off his head. Honestly, for Vlad, that's pretty generous. I mean, sure, it's got to be psychologically awful to have to dig your own grave, I won't deny that, but keep in mind, this man was working with the Saxons to overthrow Vlad, and Vlad made an example out of him, but still gave him a Christian funeral rite, and just cut off his head rather than torture the man. That, as far as I'm concerned, seems tame compared to the things this man's done otherwise. Like, he could have done a lot worse to this guy, I feel like.
On his return to Wallachia, he put all Saxon merchants who were found circumventing his trade restrictions on the stake as well, and had some boiled in a huge cauldron.
I found no record of this part. I think you're buying into the propaganda of Matthias.
The same fate befell 41 Saxon students simply because Vlad suspected them of being spies. No trial was needed.
Again, no record of this, but this actually seems more plausible, so I'll let it slide. Though, to be honest, this wasn't an uncommon practice either. Back at this time period, if you had a large number of people who were suspected of spying on you, odds were pretty good. A lot of them were, and Vlad was trying to clean house at the time anyway, which we're going to talk about.
The feasts of blood and fire. Vlad's father's death was neither neutral nor an accident. His blunder to side with the Ottomans and then being wishy-washy about it earned him enemies in both Europe mainland and the Ottoman Empire. Vlad knew that there were a number of people responsible for his father's demise. Of course, the primary convict was Vladislav II, whom he had already usurped, but there was another prominent family with their hands stained with the blood of Vlad's father, the Boyars. The Boyars were an aristocratic ruling class in many parts of Eastern Europe, including Wallachia. Vlad knew that the Boyars would always be scheming to dispose of him, and he must deal with them before they strike. In 1457, on the occasion of Easter, he invited the entire Boyar clan in his principality for dinner at his castle in Targoviste.
Wait, Boyar clan? Like a family clan? No, the Boyars were the highest rank of feudal nobility of Eastern Europe at the time. They were a social class, kind of like the samurai of Japan. Like, they're a social group, not necessarily a family. Like you said, you actually mentioned this, so why are you calling them a clan? What Vlad did was he invited all the Boyars in Wallachia who he suspected of treachery, which granted were most of them, to his castle for a feast. I know I'm being a little nitpicky on the terminology here, I know that, but still, I mean, I gotta set the record straight.
The 500 nobles gathered in their prince's great hall and were asked by Vlad how many princes they had seen in their lives. Some said 7, others said 20, a few chimed in with the number 30. He then raised his glass for a toast and declared that they wouldn't see each other anymore. The soldiers moved quickly to seize them. A few hours later, the entire court observed them being suspended on stakes, and Vlad proudly called the scene his art piece, The Sea of Rotting Corpses. They were left there on exhibition for a very long time as a warning.
This is actually mostly true. Vlad did indeed ask the boyars how many voivodes had come and gone in recent years, and when they answered many, he asked them why. When they couldn't answer, he explained it was because of them always betraying the voivode like they did his brother Mircea, whom they had buried alive. Again, remember, he could have done that, but they had buried Mircea alive. He then announced he would solve this problem. However, we have no record of him impaling the corpses. We are told from Triptow's book that he massacred them in the dining hall with his soldiers, so it's possible he had the corpses on display, but that's not ever told, so I suppose I'll let this slide, because it's possible, but I haven't read it anywhere. But again, context is everything. These boyards have always been opportunistic and greedy, seeking the chance to depose and betray almost every voivode that ever came before. Rather than wait for them to do this to him, he dealt with them first. Harsh? Yeah, sure. Necessary? Yes.
Vlad's cruelty didn't distinguish much between friends, foes, or subjects. If something bothered him, he knew only one way to take care of it. Another one of his infamous feasts involved ordinary Romanian peasants instead of noble political rivals. On an occasion, Vlad invited a large group of local people who have been variously described as old, lame, or beggars. He lavished his unsuspecting guests with a feast, and they ate and drank long into the night. The prince then locked the diners inside the hall and told his guards to set the building on fire. Looking at his work, he remarked, "These men live off the sweat of others, so they are useless to humanity." In general, Vlad loved to incinerate things and people, sort of living up to his title, the Son of Dracula.
And there it is, folks. We finally get a bold-faced lie. Up until now, it's mostly just been half-truths or misunderstood information, but now we get two lies side by side. First, that story about killing the peasants. I found no record of it. Couldn't find it. If it exists, it was likely another Hungarian propaganda piece. But want to know how I know that this story is most likely not true? The Wallachian peasantry loved Vlad. They adored him. He was a national hero and remains one to this day in Romania. If he really randomly rounded up old and lame people for slaughter, he would not have been loved by his people. Now, it is true that Vlad had a low opinion of beggars. The biggest sin that Vlad hated was theft, and he believed that begging was a form of theft, especially if the person was healthy enough to work but didn't. This quote you said of him is actually a real quote from him. But let me finish it for you. You didn't finish it. Vlad said, quote, "These men live off the sweat of others, so they are useless to humanity. It is a form of thievery. In fact, the masked robber in the forest demands your purse, but if you are quicker with your hand and more vigorous than he, you can escape from him. However, these vagabonds take your belongings gradually by begging, but they still take it. They are worse than robbers. May such men be eradicated from my land." So, it is possible he killed or tortured lazy vagabonds and beggars. Yeah, that's possible. But the old and lame who were too weak or incapable of working? No. Even his own people would not have abided by that. They would not have liked that. Keep in mind, the people of Romania, and now and back then, love Vlad Dracula. If he rounded up old people, lame people, disabled people, and weak people just to kill them because he didn't think they were helping the economy or helping the people, he would not be a beloved hero. They'd call him evil. But talk to any Romanian, they'll probably tell you, no, dude, he was awesome. Now, as for living, that other bit you said, living up to the name the Son of Dracula. Well, that's because his father was named Dracula. It means the dragon, so he is the son of the dragon. But thanks to Hungarian propaganda, you know, what Matthias was doing, they reinvented his name to mean son of the devil in an attempt to further slander Vlad. And you're falling right into it. Please stop that.
He also had a morbid sense of humor as he enjoyed using extreme tickling as a method of torment, along with flaying the skin of the soles of the victim's feet. Oh man, not the feet.
That image is depicting a Han Chinese tickling torture method practiced from 206 AD to 220 AD. This has nothing to do with Vlad. Even if he did practice this himself, he was not the only one. Nice try, but this is another bold-faced lie.
The Forest of Stakes. 6 months after the death of Dan III, Vlad brokered a biased peace with the Saxons, knowing very well that the Ottomans would soon be knocking on his door, and he didn't want to compromise his position by having a fight on two fronts at once. Until 1459, Vlad had paid the Ottomans a hefty annual tribute of 10,000 ducats to keep them happy as he dealt with Saxons, but once the peace happened, he stopped paying the Ottomans. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed sent his ambassadors to collect the arrear of 3 years, along with the demand of 500 young boys for the Ottoman army as the penalty.
You make it sound like the 500 young boys was not a normal request, as it was a penalty. This was actually part of what the Ottomans did regularly under the Janissary program. The Ottoman Empire's elite soldiers were the Janissary Corps. These warriors were actually made up of young boys taken from Christian lands and indoctrinated into the Sultan's army. Vlad had been preventing the Ottomans from entering Wallachia to collect these conscript, and thus the Sultan was now demanding that he must not only pay the original tribute 3 times over, since he'd been withholding it for 3 years, but they demanded 500 boys to be handed over as well to make up for their lack of conscripts. This wasn't just a penalty, it was making up for net losses for the Janissaries.
When the ambassadors proudly reiterated the Sultan's demands with very little respect for Vlad, the prince reminded them that they were in his court and should not have addressed it without taking off their turbans. Given that they prioritized their turbans over showing respect to him, he ordered his soldiers to nail the turbans into the ambassadors' skulls, so they may never be able to take them off. Ever.
Yep, he sure did. A deed that sealed Vlad's legacy in the hearts of the Ottomans. I mean, you can call it barbaric, but would you really like me to go into what the Ottomans did to him and his brother and every other boy they brought into their fold to become Janissaries? I mean, I could go into it, but YouTube would be quite upset if I did. Tell you what, go look up Skanderberg, the Albanian hero. He was a former Janissary who defected from the Ottomans, and his history as a Janissary is quite unpleasant. Some of you might say this is a whataboutism, but the title of this video is trying to say that Vlad is the face of evil. But there are those who have done just as bad, if not worse. So how can he be the face of evil if he doesn't really stand out from the crowd?
Before the news of his ambassador's fate reached Sultan Mehmed, Vlad moved quickly and captured the Ottoman city of Gurju. He dusted off his Ottoman general's armor and colors to pose as one. He spoke fluent Turkish to make Gurju guards open the gate for him. What followed was exactly what you would expect from Vlad the Son of Dragon. His army began laying down fire on the fortress as Wallachian generals gathered the Ottoman officials of the fortress. Vlad asked his guards to push the heads of arrested officials into the cauldrons of hot oil until they were dead. Soon, Vlad continued his offense along the villages near the Danube, decimating every piece of Ottoman settlement in his way. Now, what would you do to Vlad to protect your village?
This is a very loaded and obviously biased question, and it feels almost forced in. This feels so clunky. This feels like a clunkily inserted line, but okay. Vlad was at war with the Ottomans. He was attacking those cities and villages to inform the Sultan he was not on the Sultan's side and would break his hold on Wallachia. He didn't just kill either. According to Ibrahim again, he writes, quote, "For about 5 days in the Sultan's land nothing remained. The whole land was made empty, and Dracula drove others who were Christian into his land and settled them there. And having taken a vast multitude of conquests, he returned." He was not just out destroying randomly. He was destroying his enemies and protecting those who were Christian and under the influence of the Ottomans. So, what would I do to Vlad to protect my village? Easy. I'd pay the Prince of Wallachia homage and offer him my sword in service. The man was a hero of Wallachia, and I would fight by his side if asked. Pretty sure he'd leave my village alone as a result. I sense incredible bias from you, Nutty History. Cut it out.
Enraged, Mehmed sent 60,000 men armed with a plethora of advanced weapons to invade Wallachia. Vlad had only 24,000 men at his disposal, so open combat was out of the question. He had to come up with another way to send the Ottomans back. As Ottomans moved towards Targoviste, Vlad surprised them first with guerrilla warfare, an ambush at night that cost the Ottomans a grand total of 5,000 casualties.
You're referring to the famous Night Raid of Dracula, one of the most legendary and ambitious military offenses in history. Dracula stormed the camp of the Ottomans and did such damage and slaughtering so many, Mehmed himself reportedly fled his own camp in terror and had to be dragged back when the fighting was done. He struck such fear in the Ottomans they constructed palisades around their tents every night afterwards just to make sure Dracula never got close to them again. And although Dracula failed to kill the Sultan in his attack, he practically broke the Sultan's spirit. He would finish breaking it in just a minute.
But after the surprise came the shocker. When the Ottoman army arrived at the outskirts of Targoviste, they witnessed fields burned down as far as the eye could go. But these weren't empty fields. Instead of crops, the fields were populated with stakes, and those stakes had 20,000 people on them. The Ottoman army realized that these people weren't Wallachians, but Ottomans. Vlad had gathered every Ottoman he could find in Wallachia and mass eliminated them, simply as a warning, without any regard for the victim. The mile-long semicircle of death spooked the Ottomans so hard that they immediately retreated their forces.
Excuse me, what?
The Ottoman army realized that these people weren't Wallachians, but Ottomans. Vlad had gathered every Ottoman he could find in Wallachia and mass eliminated them, simply as a warning, without any regard for the victim.
This is again loaded and emotionally charged language. Did you know that after the night raid that we just talked about, the Sultan began rounding up Wallachian citizens and had them cut in two lengthwise? According to Tursun Beg, a Turkish chronicler of the time, quote, "This is why, as the Quran says, the powerful sword must fall upon them and split them in two. 3,700 infidels were brought to the Sultan alive and then cut in two." Do you think Mehmet had any regard for the victims? Did he have any care for them as he butchered Wallachian citizens? See? Stop using emotionally charged rhetoric. It doesn't work well when further context is provided. Now, as for the forest itself, it was indeed made up of mostly Ottoman soldiers, dignitaries, civilians, and prisoners. But bear in mind that Dracula was currently at war with the Ottomans, and seeing as he'd recently finished a huge raid all around Wallachia to expunge the Ottoman presence, he had plenty of bodies to use. And I would again remind you that the tactic was not new, just much more effective. You see, impalement was a known and practiced execution method in Hungary, across Romania, and in Turkey. The difference here is that Dracula was not just using it as an execution method, but as psychological weaponry to strike terror into the hearts of his enemies. This was not just for the sake of cruelty and wickedness, but to terrify the Sultan and give him an edge against the Sultan. As you just admitted that, you just said that's what he did. You can call it cruel if you like, and maybe it was, but it was meant with purpose, not just for his own amusement. In fact, all of Christendom was happy for Vlad. They were celebrating his success. A small army of less than 30,000 men had repulsed the Turkish army that dwarfed them using excellent psychological warfare and guerrilla tactics. It was unprecedented. So, despite you saying it was cruel and awful and had no regard for life, let's keep in mind, the Turks didn't have much regard for civilian life either, and the entire world was happy with what Vlad did. They certainly didn't see it as evil.
The origin of bloodthirst. Vlad III of Alakia is, and perhaps always will be, a controversial figure in the annals of history. On one hand, for many people of Romania, he is a national hero, the scourge of the relentless Ottoman Empire that exploited the people of Wallachia and Moldavia, the two principalities that formed the modern nation of Romania. But for many Romanians and people from other parts of the world, Vlad the Impaler was a terrible, bloodthirsty, and unhinged tyrant whose cruelty didn't differentiate between friend and foe.
Okay, dude, you really need to get someone to edit your script. First you say, for many Romanians, he is a national hero. But then you follow up with, but for many Romanians, So how do the Romanians view him, dude? I'll tell you right now, Romania loves Dracula. He's still widely celebrated and appreciated by them even to this day. The reason so many have a negative view of him today is due to the propaganda spread by Matthias Corvinus during his smear campaign of Dracula, and thanks to Bram Stoker's book. But keep in mind, Stoker did not really do any research on the real Vlad Dracula, and mostly just wanted to use the name for his monster. Romania adores Vlad Dracula, but your bias won't allow you to even admit that without trying to still make him sound wicked to some degree.
Was he born a madman with a penchant for steaks? Well, let's just say it is much more likely that he turned out that way thanks to the Ottomans.
Thank you!
Vlad III's father, Vlad II Dracul, got his surname after his induction into a Christian crusading order known as the Order of the Dragon. But this success was short-lived. When the Hungarian general of Wallachia, John Hunyadi, counterattacked and began pushing the Ottomans back, Vlad II tried to act like he had nothing to do with the Ottomans. Not the wisest move, of course. Sultan Murad grew suspicious of Vlad II's loyalty and invited him to stay with him at Gallipoli. After everything, Vlad knew that declining the Sultan's invitation when he was already pissed would not be in the best interest. It was a gamble to accept the invite, and the Voivode decided to bite the bullet. As soon as he arrived at the city gates of Gallipoli, he was arrested along with his two younger sons, 14-year-old Vlad III and 7-year-old Radu the Handsome. Quite a name, Radu the Handsome. While the father was released after a year, the two kids spent 6 years with the Ottomans. While young Radu was obedient and listened to the Ottomans like his own family, Vlad III was already a teenager, and that young rebellion spirit was alive and kicking.
No. Why are you phrasing it that way? Don't phrase it that way. You're making it sound like that they were just adopted by the Sultan or something, like they were just, hanging out at summer camp. That's not what this was. They were prisoners of the Sultan. Radu got out of a lot of his trouble because he was handsome, and the Sultan, he let's just say he really, really liked the way Radu looked, and let's let's let you draw the rest of the connections yourselves. I'm not going to go there. YouTube will get very upset with me. But Radu fell right into the pocket of the Sultan and later became an enemy of Vlad later in life. Vlad, meanwhile, would not renounce his Christianity. He would not renounce his kingdom. He would not renounce where he came from. He was very rebellious because he knew where he came from, and he knew that he was, at his heart, an enemy of the Sultan and the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't just a teenage angst phase. This wasn't just two kids going to summer camp and one being very obedient and good and the other one just being a teen angst. No, no, no. One was a rebel trying to maintain his roots. The other, let's leave that alone.
Before being captured by the Ottomans, Vlad had spent his childhood at Sayasora among the Hungarian royalty. He received a first-class education on how to be a prince around people who believed that they were the descendants of Spartans and thus made their royal children act like they were in a Zack Snyder movie.
Why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about go back to the Ottoman stuff. Explain the Ottoman portion. You started off good. You mentioned that the Ottomans were a major factor in making Vlad what he was. Go back to that. Explain what they did. Why aren't you explaining what they did?
Vlad was made to stand outside in storms, hunt hares with his bare hands, shoot down eagles with slingshots, and ride unsaddled horses by the age of 5. The house where Vlad spent his childhood in Hungary is now a gaudy-themed restaurant called Casa de Dracula. The building overlooks the Councilman Square in Sayasora, which once was a small jail when Vlad lived there. He often observed prisoners being dragged from the prison to Jeweler's Dungeon. Do you think Vlad was born insane, or did the Ottomans...
Okay, dude, I'm honestly at a loss. So, you spend all this time, most of the video, basically listing off all of Vlad's evils and wrongdoings, and then wait until the very end of the video, like the last chunk, to provide the context of his upbringing and learning, which would be good. But instead of exploring the things the Ottomans did to him, because you mentioned he was under the servitude of the Ottomans, but you don't mention any of what they did to him. You simply mention his growth as a child under the Hungarians, and how it was like a Zack Snyder film, ignoring all the horrible things done to him and his brother by the Ottomans. You're making it sound like it was his upbringing under the Hungarians that made him who he was, not his upbringing under the Ottomans. I wish you'd explored that more. I'm sorry, but Nutty History, your bias is clear. Your desire to withhold information is appalling, because based on what you've said here, it's clear from what you've said, you read Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally, two of Dracula's biographers. I recognize some of the language you used here. But you decided to avoid certain talking points and certain facts about his life. So let me be very clear. Vlad was as much a monster as he was a moralist. He believed in justice above all, and while his punishments and executions were harsh and fierce, they were essential to rule his homeland. To purge the wicked and sinful, to secure the control of the Christian church, and to repel the Ottoman threat. Yes, there is no question that he did cruel things while in power, but none of the things he did were without context, none were without purpose, and all made him beloved by his subjects. He did the impossible by turning a massive army and its sultan back home with their tail between their legs, and he defied the nobles and kings who had planned to remove him from power the moment he took it. To put Vlad's life in a bigger perspective, Vlad grew up a prisoner and a slave to the Turks. And when he re-entered his homeland at 18, he was resented from the moment he got there. He was plotted against and betrayed almost from day one. He had to be ruthless to survive and to rule and to secure his throne. And then he had to be just as ruthless to defy those who had hurt him as a child and who continued to threaten his homeland, which he loved. You can call him a monster if you wish, but it took a monster to defy the devils at his doorstep, because even devils know to not rouse a dragon. Sorry, Nutty History. Not a good take. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Take care.